My name is Emily Stimson Chapman, and I was born and raised Catholic, although I was not really taught what the church teaches. I grew up during a time when religious education programs were in a state of chaos, and so I didn't know what it meant to be Catholic. I just thought it meant you went to a Catholic church on Sunday, and maybe you went to a Catholic school and you celebrated St. Patrick's Day. Uh, when I was 19, I went away to college, and all of my general cultural Catholicism wasn't enough to help me make sense of the world I encountered there. A world where people were sleeping around, even though I was always told that was wrong, and using drugs, even though I was also always told that was wrong. And I didn't know why they were wrong. So I started asking questions, and God sent me a wonderful evangelical young man who helped me answer a lot of those questions. He introduced me to Jesus and C.S. Lewis. So Jesus was most important. C.S. Lewis was right behind. And through their influence, both C.S. Lewis and my friend, I gave my life to Jesus. I spent the next 6 years learning to love Jesus more and getting to know him better, but in a Protestant community. I pretty much walked away from the church without even asking any serious questions about it. I didn't know what the faith was because I hadn't been taught it, so I didn't know what questions to ask. I'm so grateful for those years as a Protestant because during that time, I really came to understand how much Jesus loves me, and I came to understand what a relationship looked like him. I am closer to Jesus than I ever would have been if not for those wonderful people. But there wasn't a clear system of doctrine, and there wasn't the Mass. As much as I enjoyed the homilies or the sermons that I heard preached in the Protestant churches I went to, I missed kneeling. I missed prayer. I missed liturgy because I felt like it allowed my whole body to worship God. It wasn't just sitting there and listening to him in my mind, but it was kneeling in front of him. So at that point, I made friends with a good Catholic who started asking me questions about authority. I already knew who Jesus was. When I read that C.S. Lewis book, I knew I had to decide if he was Lord, liar, or lunatic, and I decided he was Lord. I believed he was Lord. I loved him as my Lord. But now I had to decide who the church was. Was the church the whore of Babylon? Was she a man-made institution that was oppressing people with man-made rules? Or was she the bride of Christ? And for me, what helped me answer that question was the Bible itself. The Bible was how I knew about Jesus. The Bible was how I had grown close to Jesus. But where did the Bible come from? Somebody had to write it. Somebody had to translate it. Someone had to copy out those pages in long, laborious hours when there were no printing presses, there were no electric lights. And I learned that was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church for 2,000 years had dedicated herself to preserving the Lord's Word, to handing it on to people, to teaching people about it. And the church wasn't going to preserve something that contradicted her very existence. Like that was illogical. If something is, filled with evidence of how you are not who you're claiming to be, you get rid of that thing or you change those things. The church didn't do that. The church preserved them. She considered them sacred. So that helped me say, yes, the church is the bride of Christ. The church has the authority to bind and loose. There is a succession from Peter right up to the present Pope. At that time, it was John Paul II. And once I realized that the church did have the authority to interpret scripture, the church did have the authority to help me make sense of how I lived my faith in the world. The church did have the authority to say, yes, the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ. Yes, popes are the successors of Peter. Then it was a question for me of saying, okay, I accept the church's authority. Now I need to understand everything else. One of the great things when I first gave my life to Jesus was this recognition that I could talk to him anytime, anywhere. I didn't have to be at Mass. I didn't have to be in a church. I could always go to him. I could tell him every thought, every feeling. I could pour out my heart to him. I loved that intimacy. Then when I became Catholic and discovered the Eucharist, that intimacy was like passing from dating to marriage. I couldn't just pour out my heart to Jesus. I could receive Jesus in the Eucharist. I couldn't just talk to Jesus. I could go kneel before him in the Eucharist and look at him in adoration. The experience of adoration for me was probably one of the most transformative experiences of coming back to the church. I'd never heard of Eucharistic adoration. I didn't know what it was. And a friend took me to a Eucharistic adoration chapel maybe a month after I'd started going back to daily Mass. And you could feel the difference. Like I knew when I'd gone into Protestant churches, I'd grown up Catholic. I knew there was a feeling to Catholic churches, but I could never have put my hand on it. But I knew Protestant churches didn't have it. They were very pretty, you heard good homilies, but there was something missing. And when I walked into that adoration chapel, I could finally name what was missing. The Eucharist was missing. The real presence was not there. Jesus was present in the hearts of the believers. He was present in people gathered, but his real physical presence wasn't there. And anyone who's married knows that it's great to talk to your spouse over the phone, but it's so much better to be held by them in your arms. It's better to kiss them. It's better to touch them, to hold their hand. And that's what the Eucharist allowed me to do. It allowed that relationship to become one of deep intimacy and an abiding presence of just being able to be with them in a way that I never was when I was just talking to Jesus. And the whole world became an experience of God's grace for me. And that's where, the joyful relationship I had had with Christ as a Protestant became this joyful relationship not only with Jesus, but with all of his creation and all of his saints and all of the angels. There was just so much more. It was like having gone out with a guy who you liked, but then meeting his family and realizing they were even more amazing and that he had all these wonderful friends. It was an introduction into a family, into a home, into a community that gave me a real foretaste of what we will, God willing, experience when we are with him in heaven.